Welcome to the Lubrizol360 podcast. I'm Mike McCabe, the Marketing Director for Lubrizol Additives, and today I'm joined by Mark Davies and Keith Howard, and we're going to be talking about how legislation for vehicle emissions in China is moving China to the forefront of automotive legislation in the world, and the impact that's going to have on the type of fuels and lubricants that are used. Before we get going, Mark, Keith, would you like to introduce yourselves?
Sure, yes. I'm Mark Davies. I'm the Director of Strategic Technology for Lubrizol Additives.
I'm Keith Howard. I'm a Technology Manager in Mark's group, and my focus is on the emissions portfolio for Lubrizol.
Now, both of you have lived and worked in China for many years. Can you tell us anything about your experiences there to help us understand the Chinese market a little bit more?
Well, both Mark and I lived there for between 4 and 5 years. We both went across with our families and we were both based in Shanghai. Mark led the regional technology team there. I started my role in engine oils and moved to our equipment manufacturers group. Mark repatriated at the end of 2017, me at the end of 2018.
I think some of the biggest takeaways over in China is when you first arrive is just the sheer number of people and the sheer number of vehicles that you see on the streets. That sense of chaos and sense of just magnitude of the number of people that you see moving around is quite eye-opening, and that plays into some of these emissions and air quality issues that we recognise as well. So it's a very dynamic, very exciting place to live, and there's just a lot going on there.
Yeah, it's certainly right. There are a lot of issues with air quality in China, and Shanghai is no exception. The air quality at times was not good, and if you wanted to go outside, you really needed to wear a pollution mask at times.
Yeah, I remember when I lived in Beijing that we would be checking air quality before we went out. And it becomes part of your daily life to be conscious of air quality and how it impacts you. Did you find that impacted what you did as families?
For me, absolutely. I was fortunate to have my second child born actually in Shanghai. So we had a young family there, and us, like many people around, were very, very conscious of the air quality. As you said, Mike, we used to check that every day. It didn't stop you doing things, but it was something that was certainly a very conscious part of everyday life.
Yeah, and for me, my hobby is cycling, and we had a group of people that used to ride out in Shanghai, and many of the rides were actually cancelled due to air quality, and occasionally we'd go out riding kitted up with pollution masks.
Not only have we seen over the last decade the rapid growth in the number of vehicles in China, we've also seen China move from introducing back in around 2000 its first emissions legislation to what we talk about now as China 6, which will become the latest. And I believe that that's really to try and tackle some of the pollution issues that we're talking about. Can you explain a little bit more about China 6 and what that will mean?
Well, China 6, as you say, it takes China from being relatively behind in terms of emissions legislation to being right at the forefront. And it is the toughest vehicle emissions regulation in the world. It's going to be introduced in 2 stages. China 6A will be introduced in July 2020 and 6B in July 2023. That's the schedule of implementation. 6A basically brings in limits on major pollutants that are somewhat similar to Euro 6 legislation. So all the key pollutants are addressed. China 6B will go further. There'll be a reduction in many of the limits, making it lower than Euro 6, in some cases 50% of the limit. And also there'll be the real-world driving emissions test brought in, and that really does tighten up dramatically on the need for low-emission vehicles.
I think part of it, Keith, is you've seen 2 things happening hand in hand: massive vehicle growth in the country. And so per vehicle, you need to lower those emissions in order to sort of tackle some of these pollution issues. And I guess some of the key pollutants that we're talking about here are nitrogen oxides and particulate matter. And it's some of those particulate matter emissions, which we sometimes talk about as PM 2.5, the things that get deep into your lungs. That's a really key part of China 6 and tackling this problem.
Yeah, that was the key pollutant that we all looked for when we went out at the PM 2.5 level, and that's one that's been clamped down dramatically. Particulate number legislation is being introduced, and one of the key differences between China and Europe is that those limits are applied in a way that is known as technology neutral. So, for example, in Europe, the particulate number limit only applies to direct injection gasoline engines. In China, it applies to all of them. So the chances are that in a few years from now, more or less every vehicle that is produced in China will have a particulate filter on.
You mentioned gasoline and then filters. I know from Europe, we tend to think of particulate emissions more relating to diesel fueled vehicles and diesel particulate filters. Is the same happening with gasoline as well?
Yeah, more so with direct injection gasoline engines. When you inject the fuel directly into the cylinder, there's less time for the air and the fuel to mix, so you do get more particulates, and that has been recognised in Europe for some time and addressed. But also, even in port fuel injected vehicles, under certain conditions, you can get significant particulate emissions. So as the legislation is implemented, the most reliable way to address those is to put a filter on the vehicle. So we'll see increasing number of those filters introduced over the next few years.
You know, it's also true on the heavy-duty diesel vehicles in China. The majority of the passenger car fleet is gasoline, heavily direct injection these days, which is a really big improvement in technology for fuel efficiency and other driving comforts and attributes. But there's still a lot of trucks, and those trucks absolutely will be fitted across the board now with diesel particulate filters. So that's tackling both the diesel emissions and the gasoline emissions part.
And will other technologies be fitted to the trucks as well? You know, you talked about particulates, but you also mentioned nitrous oxides.
Yeah, the two main pollutants from a diesel vehicle are oxides of nitrogen and particulates. The particulates you can address with a filter. Nitrous oxides is rather more difficult. So you'll have what we call selective catalytic reduction systems, SCR systems installed. This involves the injection of a reductant, commonly known in Europe as AdBlue, a diesel emissions fluid. That's injected and reacts over a catalyst to reduce the NOx emissions. It's a very, very effective way of addressing NOx. So we'll see both filters and SCR systems installed in China's trucks. And for China 6 and future legislations, they'll become increasingly important in terms of low temperature emissions, because there's a need to ensure that the emissions are reduced right throughout the temperature range. And it's very difficult to do so at low temperatures because catalysts naturally react better at higher temperatures.
So summarising what you were talking about then, really it's about the advancing hardware, both the engine and the after-treatment system. So if we reflect 10 or 15 years ago, the engines that were being designed in China, they were advancing rapidly, and we've now got very, very good hardware. But with these emissions legislation, you have to combine that with advanced after treatment. So now the whole system is an extremely sophisticated advanced system, engine through to after treatment.
That's correct, yeah. You'll have several catalysts, several sensors. The sensors are an important part of the system as well. All that system is integrated with the engine management system to ensure the thing works as a complete system and keeps the emissions low for long term.
And these are all, we've been talking about vehicles that have combustion engines. Where does electrification in China fit into the landscape of this as well?
Yeah, China's policy is to encourage new energy vehicles. It's hybrids, plug-in hybrids, and it's battery electric vehicles. They're doing this for several reasons. China's very reliant on imported fuel. So if they can electrify their vehicles and reduce fuel consumption that way, it's a way to reduce the dependency on imported fuels. Plus, one of the key reasons is China sees this as a potential where they can lead the world. They can lead the world in development of battery electric vehicles, in development of hybrids and all the associated technologies. And they're certainly doing that. There's a lot of government incentives for production of new energy vehicles, a lot of new startups in China, a lot of investment in battery research, those kinds of areas. So it really is taking off, and more new energy vehicles are sold in China than anywhere else in the world.
There's still going to be a balance. The reason for having this legislation, the China 6 legislation, is there's recognition that there's a balance of still a number of vehicles will need to have the engine inside them, whether that's a hybrid or whether that's a truck. So there's a two-pronged approach, really. Introduction of more stringent legislation to drive pollution down with traditional technologies or made more sophisticated, as well as the NEV, new energy vehicle type policies. So we're looking at a balanced market as we go forward. It may be transitioning, but there's still going to be a lot of those engined vehicles around which need to be legislated for and the emissions protected against.
So would a hybrid vehicle then still have the after-treatment systems you were talking about earlier?
Yes, I mean, any hybrid vehicle that has the internal combustion engine that's coming on and off will still need to have some of these after-treatment systems. And as Keith mentioned earlier on, cold start is extremely important. So a lot of these engines will be starting up, the catalysts will be cold, and managing those emissions through colder running is actually quite important.
Indeed, a hybrid vehicle will have many stop-starts, as Mark said, and every time, for example, if we take particulates, every time the engine starts, there'll be a puff of particulate matter comes out, and that could certainly result in them failing the drive cycle, especially when you get into the real-world driving emission, the RDE type testing. There's definitely the potential for them to fail on particulate emissions. So even hybrids, which are seen as clean vehicles, will need particulate filters in many cases.
And you talked earlier, you mentioned about the contamination of an emission system. Is it the fuel that contaminates it? Where does the contamination come from?
It comes from a number of sources. Over the last 10 years, fuel quality has certainly improved in China, but it can still be variable, whether that's diesel or gasoline. So contaminant from the fuel can poison the catalyst, but actually contamination from the engine oil, the lubricant can, because there's always a little bit of lubricant that's burnt, and the chemistries inside that lubricant can find their way towards the filter. And some of the chemistries that we need to put in are really important. They're the things like detergents, which clean parts of the engine, keep the engine running as it should. Things like dispersants, which again keep the sump clean. And some of those contain metal, which can form ash. And it's those sorts of contaminants that, if they find their way onto the catalyst, can actually deactivate or can poison the catalyst or block the filter.
So why can't you just take them out?
If you just take them all out, you're not going to have a very clean or very durable engine. And that's where some of the science comes in. That's where some of the technology comes in. Because if you take out all of those clever chemistries, your engine or your drive train won't function as it's supposed to. It certainly won't last the length of time it's supposed to. Put too much in or put the wrong type in and you can damage your after-treatment system. So it's a formulating balance of trying to work out what's the right amount of these different chemistries that go in. And that's something that was recognised in Europe a while ago and has continued. But the difference in China is the driving conditions are a bit different, the fuel quality is a bit different. And so there has been a real need to balance that chemistry and formulation for China and actually do all the testing in China to make sure that we're actually, developing the right technology. And that takes time, it takes years to do.
And you mentioned about the life of something. How long do parts of the engine have to survive for? Is it just the warranty period or?
Well, if we're talking about emissions, there's the warranty period, but there is also an extended emissions durability period that's built into the legislation. So China 6, it's actually another area where it's more stringent than Europe. In Europe, for passenger cars, there's a requirement for the emissions durability to be 160,000 kilometres. In China 6, it's actually 200,000 kilometres. And it's absolutely essential that you use the right fuels and lubricants to keep your engine and after treatment in good shape for that whole period. That can be critical in terms of the deterioration, the gradual deterioration of the after treatment system if you don't use the right fuels and lubricants.
And is that the same for both cars and trucks?
Trucks is another issue. Trucks are actually much longer than that. As we know, commercial vehicles are very durable and last a long time. So correspondingly, the requirement is for the emissions durability to last 700,000 kilometres for commercial vehicles. So essentially what you're getting towards is the need to keep the emissions of the vehicle low for its whole life, because all that will happen if you legislate for new vehicles to be clean and don't take care of the emissions durability, then the air quality is just going to be dominated by older, dirtier vehicles. So it's the right thing to do for the air quality.
And how is that measured throughout the vehicle's life? Will there be regular checks on the vehicle, like to check it's operating correctly?
There are a number of ways. This is a part of the legislation that's still evolving, but there will be monitoring of the onboard diagnostic systems of the vehicle. So the sensors that measure the pollution, they do a number of things. First of all, they're involved in the closed loop control of those emission systems to ensure that they perform correctly. Secondly, they'll detect failures in the system and will put the vehicle in a so-called limp home mode. An engine warning light will come up, the vehicle will go in a limp home mode, and you'll have to get the vehicle serviced. But increasingly, that onboard diagnostic information is monitored via the connectivity of the vehicles to ensure that vehicles in service are maintain the low emissions performance for the whole of the life. There'll be additional measures such as remote sensing. So if you could imagine a speed camera that we have in the roads here in the UK, if you can imagine one of those with a number plate recognition system and an emissions sensor that detects the emissions as a vehicle drives past, you'll see an increasing number of those on the roads in China, and those will be linked back into the monitoring system. So vehicles will then be pulled and given a full inspection, and if a pattern of failure from a particular vehicle manufacturer, particular vehicle type is recognised, then the manufacturer will be taken to task and will be made to reduce that, and potentially will face some penalties too.
Is this what you meant earlier by real-world driving?
The real-world driving emissions is something else. That's part of the initial testing. So the real-world driving emissions is something that's already going on in Europe, and it involves taking the vehicle, running it out on the road with portable emissions measurement systems, so-called PEMs, and measuring the emissions over routes, urban driving, suburban driving, driving out in the countryside, and over a range of terrains, and then statistically analysing that data to make sure it meets the criteria. The difference in China is the real-world driving conditions are different and more severe. So the temperature range, China's a big country, big temperature range, so that correspondingly the real-world driving emissions temperature limits are wider, so it's more difficult to get the emissions right across that temperature range. And very significantly, the altitude range is much higher too. I think it's 2,400 metres as opposed to 1,300 metres in Europe. So, and generally the emissions performance deteriorates when you get at high altitudes. So again, very difficult to meet the legislation.
So it's going to become essential to keep a vehicle running efficiently and reliably. So I can imagine that maintenance becomes even more important. How different are the types of lubricants that are going to be needed, and how does that impact maintenance of the vehicle and an understanding of different lubricants?
Well, certainly one of the challenges I think that the industry faces here is how do you, if you designed the new technology that I spoke about a few minutes ago, which takes a lot of time, how do you then ensure that that technology is widely adopted? Some of the observations that we found when we were in China, and probably still hold true today, is there's a very wide range of oil quality that you can find. And so, as Keith was talking about a minute ago, if you need to make sure that you're maintaining that vehicle throughout the whole of its life, you need to make sure there's access to the right lubricants and fuels throughout the whole of its life. And that's a problem right now. So a big challenge for the industry in general is to make these technologies available across the board for the life of the vehicles, so that you don't have consumers and users falling foul of an in-use emissions issue, in 10 years' time if it's a car, or maybe shorter if it's a truck. So it's very, very important that we see those technologies become widely adopted and available. And some of that can be managed through the servicing in the workshop. So how vehicles are brought in and how they're serviced will change over this time as well.
I think that's not just a problem in China. I think throughout the whole of Asia, and I think I've seen it more on maybe commercial vehicles, where the types of oils that are available, in some cases go back to technology from the early 90s or the 1980s, way before any of these modern emission systems were introduced. So having the right lubricant technology used to keep the vehicles running efficiently is a real challenge, as you mentioned. You talked about new technology, and you mentioned earlier about some of the impacts that can have on the after-treatment system. What have you done and what have we been doing to develop new technology in China?
As I said earlier on, a big challenge and a big issue that we need to deal with is balancing these chemistries that we put into the oil, whether they're dispersants or detergents or antioxidants. All of these things need to be balanced. And then we need to take that balanced technology and understand how it works in the marketplace. So we started some of that sort of work 5 or 6 years ago, even before some of these after-treatment systems were fully established, but by taking advanced prototypes, placing them on vehicles in country, doing work with those vehicles, running a drive cycle that a user would actually do in the country, and then measuring the impact and ensuring that we've got the right sort of technology ready for now when these legislation comes in. That was a very important piece of technology leadership that we try to do in the market. Because if you don't do that early, and it does take time, suddenly you're behind the curve and those technologies won't be available when the legislation comes in and the customers need them.
So when you're testing in the field, how long are these field trials that are being run?
The field trials that we do are generally long duration. So, for example, if we did a study on gasoline particulate filters and the right lubricants for gasoline particulate filters, and that was run for between 160,000 and 200,000 kilometres, basically to look at a similar duration to the emissions durability legislation requirements. So that takes between a year and 18 months, even in a high usage scenario such as the one that we were using. We used a taxi fleet in Shanghai, so they were being used 24/7, but still it took a long time to get that distance covered.
I think if you look at the end-to-end piece, you've got the formulation development, the fundamental knowledge that goes behind that, which takes time, a couple of years of work there. Getting those technologies into the vehicles, running the trial, that takes maybe a year or two there. And then understanding the results, turning it into something that's actually usable, product development, that then takes some time. So if you're looking at the whole kind of continuum of understanding what's coming at you from a legislation point of view to getting a product that the consumer can use, you could be 5, 6, 7 years depending on what you're doing. It's a long process.
Absolutely. And I think we're even starting to look at what comes after China 6, and we're starting to get into those kind of areas and starting to think about the work that we need to do for the next legislation evolution beyond that.
We've talked a lot about China 6. At the same time, there's fuel efficiency legislation in China being introduced, as I understand it, at the same time as China 6. How is that impacting the types of technologies as well?
Well, I mean, obviously, as you said, Mike, it's not just particulate and NOx emissions that the world is concerned about. Carbon dioxide emissions, which directly relate to fuel efficiency, are absolutely huge. And China's no exception to that. So in combination with all of this after-treatment work and all this other legislation work that's going on, there's a drive to reduce fuel consumption, increase fuel efficiency, reduce CO2, and the type of lubricant that you use can have a very direct impact on that as well. So there's a drive towards lower friction and lower viscosity lubricants in the marketplace, and that provides yet another formulating challenge that we have to deal with.
And does that just apply to cars or trucks as well?
It applies to both. The legislation, the CAFC, Corporate Average Fuel Consumption legislation, is becoming increasingly stringent for both passenger cars and commercial vehicles. So, for example, in 2025, the limit for fuel consumption of passenger cars will have dropped from over 8 litres to just 4 litres per 100 kilometres. So that's a very big change and a very stringent limit, and that's over a 15-year period. Obviously, China's the biggest automotive market in the world, so the total fuel consumption has risen in parallel with the number of vehicles on the road. So a change from 8 to 4 litres per 100 kilometres is going to save about 160 billion litres of fuel, and that's at a cost of over 1 trillion RMB. That's an annual saving at the kind of current forecourt prices for fuel in China. And there's similar improvements in commercial vehicles, and it's probably more important because the cost to an operator of running a commercial vehicle fleet is somewhat dominated by the fuel costs. So a fleet operator having about 25 trucks could expect to save over 1 million RMB in fuel costs per year with a new truck complying to the latest fuel consumption legislation.
So what you start to see now, which almost seems unimaginable maybe 5 or 6 years ago, is you start to see viscosity grades like 0W20 becoming much more commonplace in the passenger car market, and SEE 5W30 becoming more commonplace in heavy-duty trucks, which you just wouldn't have thought possible, previously. And that move is really accelerating. And so now you've got this really complicated system where you've got a need to develop the right kind of chemistry technology inside the oil to protect those after-treatment systems. At the same time, you've got to put the right chemistry in to allow you to lower the viscosity and provide the fuel efficiency. And you've got to kind of bring all of that together in a timely fashion so that you can get those products ready.
It is just incredible that the change. When I was living there in early 2010s, some of those viscosity grades were never even talked about. They were so far in the future, yet within just a short number of years, they're pretty prevalent across the country. It's just incredible, that scale of change and the speed of adoption of these new technologies. We've been talking today about China 6 and about the fuel efficiency legislation. As we come to a close, are there any final comments that you'd like to make about people in our industry, our listeners should be thinking about?
Yeah, I would say China 6 is a call to action to everybody involved in the industry. We need to make sure that the right fuels and lubricants are there because they're absolutely vital to long-term emissions compliance. And that means the legislators have to make sure that the legislation is fully enforced. to ensure that the vehicles follow that legislation. The OEMs must ensure they specify the right lubricant quality for both protection of the engine and for after-treatment compatibility, and they have to ensure that they're available to all the OEM workshops. The fuel suppliers need to ensure that good quality fuel is widely available, and technology suppliers such as Lubrizol need to make sure that the right technology is provided in good time. That's why we need to work well ahead of the legislation to get that technology in place so that the oil companies can supply that through their network. And finally, the end user. There's an obligation to the end user to actually ensure their vehicles are maintained and kept in good condition to ensure the emissions stay low throughout their life.
I think the final thing maybe I'd add to that is the work's never done. So, as Keith said earlier on, looking forward to the next round of emissions legislation and trying to anticipate what's going to happen 5, 6, 7, 8 years out. That's a really important part of what we need to do and the industry needs to do, because the work and the research needs to start now so that we're ready for the kind of the next upgrade, which will surely come as it's kind of a continuous process.
Well, one thing I'd say is, it's a very big challenge, but it's also a massive opportunity. There are 1.4 billion people in China. And if the industry all play their part, we can provide the right fuels, the right lubricants. We can enable basically better air quality in China and a better future for 1.4 billion people who are the citizens of China.
On that, Keith, Mark, I'd like to thank you for today, for bringing some great insight into what's happening in China. And thank you for listening today.